welcome back. This is Than Gamer, and I'm going to be showing you how to make a little elevator that goes up and down. So let's say you've got a platform. I'm just going to make a little platform for the upper level. And this upper level, I'm just going to make it a little bit longer. Cool. I'm just going to also duplicate that and edit it for the actual elevator. Let's make it a little bit more square, maybe a little longer. There we go. I'm going to tweak the elevator and kind of give it a different color so you can see it a bit better. And let's line them up. Okay, cool. Let's get a puppet so we can see what we're doing and scale and see if our elevator is big enough. Yep, looks about right. Let's pop you onto the ground. There we go. So there's our elevator. We can't get there. Okay. So we're going to trigger the elevator from the ground floor and then make it go to the top floor. And if you trigger it on the top floor, it's going to go down to the bottom floor. I'm going to stamp a chip onto the actual elevator where we're going to put the logic for the elevator. Basically, the first thing we need to do is have a keyframe to say where do we want the elevator to go to when anything happens. So that's where we want it to end up. So the elevator will go from that state to that state. It's also possible to do the smoothing inside here. You can add some smoothing times down here, but I want to use these ease outs, and you can only use those inside a timeline. So let's pop the keyframe into a timeline. It's going to take about 2 seconds, I guess, to sorry, I'm a little bit fiddly with the interface. And then you can just put a blank keyframe with nothing in it. You just immediately stop recording. Then you can either set the ease in out there in the keyframe, or actually just click on these till you get that double S curve. So now if we play the timeline, it should smoothly go up and obviously jump down. So, but we want it to be reversible, and we want it to have 2 states. So let's first get a trigger zone up so that we can actually detect where the player is. I'm just going to make it rectangular shaped. That's kind of like the size of the elevator. You can make it smaller if you want it to be like maybe just a little bit in. So if you wanted to do it like that, you can also do that. So if you're touching the elevator, it already starts going up. You have to be kind of on the elevator. Also, the puppet's tag has to actually enter the side wall, so the puppet's middle is already then through, so it's a good detection to make it slightly smaller in most cases. Oh yeah, forgot, it's not a good idea to always leave the bottom because you might have accidental triggers. So I usually just do the base of the elevator as the trigger point. So we can power the timeline when you step on it, and then it goes up, and when you step off it, ooh, then it jumps down, and I can't get down. Let's say I die or whatever. So that was a bit silly. Now to fix that, it's actually quite a clever little thing. You take a timer and you set the timer to positional, and you set the target time to the same time as the timeline. But it doesn't have to be. You could essentially make the timeline as a percentage where you want things to happen, and then you can control how fast the timeline should play from the timer, because the timer will be feeding its timer output into the actual playhead. So now instead of triggering the timeline, we trigger the timer. So now if we step on it, it triggers the timeline, but it still goes down without me. You need to, it keeps going down all the time. So, okay. And now there's a clever little solution to fix that. What we're going to do is we're going to add, depending on how many states your elevator should or shouldn't have, you add a selector. Just going to wipe that. So the detected output, we're going to wire to the toggle output, which moves it to the next state. So if you detect the puppet on the trigger zone, move the elevator to the top state. And then when you detect it at the top, it triggers and goes to the bottom state. So it'll keep toggling between the top and the bottom states. But now for this to work, it needs to output the number of the trigger you're on to the timer, so the timer knows what state to go. And we're going to use the output called active port. This allows you to also, so the active port of 0 will put the timeline here. So that the selector starts off at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as its active ports. So 0 is sent out initially. Port A is 0. Then the active port is 0. Then when you trigger the selector, it moves to B, and the output port will be number 1. So then it'll move to the end of the timeline. But instead of jumping, a positional timer will take 2 seconds to move from the one value that you gave it to the next value that you gave it. And that controls the animation speed. So now if you step on it'll go to the top, and it'll stay at the top because it's still in state number 2. And when you trigger onto the elevator, it'll go back down to the bottom. There might be some edge bugs, like you step on and you step off and things like that, so you could check for that. But this is just a very basic system just to detect a two-way state. And it saves a little bit because if you look at the actual logic, we didn't use a signal manipulator or anything to create a pulse of any kind. And the reason why it works is because the trigger zone has from 0 to 1 rise when you step onto the trigger zone. That level change is enough to trigger the output next trigger over here. So while you're on the elevator, so if we look in test mode, so now we're in the second stage. While I'm still on here, the value stays 1 for the trigger zone. It doesn't actually become 0, which means that there isn't any signal sent to go to the next port. As soon as you step off, it stays on that port because still we don't have a rising, you need a rising signal on the selector. And as soon as you give it a rising signal, the timeline reverses back to 0 again. This also means you could set up multiple trigger zones, all triggering the next output. Each one makes the elevator go to a different station of some kind. And you can have multiple states with multiple keyframes going to multiple positions. I just wanted to make this a short video, so I'm not going to do that part of it. But that's, with the short amount of gadgets, you can achieve a smoothly animating and triggering two-state elevator. And then there's one last tip, is that when you sorry, I'm getting stuck in test mode. One last thing is that, let's say you had a variable. I'm just going to simulate the variable. Well, actually, we can do the actual variable. It's a variable modifier. Let's say you had a variable, and when the scene loads, and remember, if you want it to be persistent in Dream, you have to click that. When the scene loads, the variable will be 1. So there, if I rewind, the variable becomes 1. Obviously, you will set this value during the gameplay, and when it loads, the value will automatically be what it is in the current dream for this user. What we then do is we get the value of the variable. I haven't named them, so you have to name them normally. And then you can drop this directly into the active port. So now, once the game loads, the platform moves to the top, and you can't access it because it's getting the value from the variable. You must have triggered it somewhere in the logic of the game. And then you can also force the variable to go directly into the timeline instead of going to the selector. And why would you want to do that? And that's especially handy for when you load the level and elevators and objects need to be in a persistent state based on the variable that you saved. So in this case, I triggered some sort of platform. I don't want the user to go back. So now the platform should stay at the top. So you take your variable modifier and you wire it directly into the playhead. So it looks like this on your gadget. So both your variable as well as your timer can control where you are in the actual state. So if you load now, you'll see that the scene loads without animating directly to the top. Whereas if we loaded the scene with a 0 variable and we rewind, everything still works like it should. So let's say this is a one-way mechanism. You're only allowed to go up and down. You can go up and down, but when you go beyond this point and you come back from another dream, you can't go back down again. So that's what you do here, is that once you've reached the top or some other switch, let's say there's a switch in the game, some button you triggered or something, you then set the value to 1 and then that value of 1 will force the timeline into the second state. If you haven't reached that point in the game yet, it'll just work like normal. And that's a simple 2-state elevator. Thanks for watching, guys. Like and subscribe.